I'm ready to pin this razor up. I decided to use some stainless steel washers along with brass rod. I kind of like the look of the two metals together. It's all personal preference. So the first thing I'm going to do is, I've fed this rod through the wedge end holes here, and so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to trim the rod. To do that, what I'll do is I'll leave about 1/16 of an inch hanging off of one side, and then I just use a pair of wire cutters. Actually, I don't have any flush cutters, so you could save yourself a step if you had a pair of flush cutters. But I found that these are about, they leave about 1/16 of an inch sticking out anyway when I just cut them flush. So I usually just cut the other side flush. And so I end up with just about enough on both sides here after I even them out. So you'll notice that I have one side that's flat, and then the other side I've actually got a pinch on there. And so I need to flatten this pinch out. So I take it to the belt sander for just a second. I've done this a lot, so I'm fairly used to it, but I just have to be very careful not to hit the scale against it. As long as I just sand off that little pinched pin there and make it, I'm just going to make that flat real quick. So as you can see, I have two flat sides now, and I do probably have a little bit more than I need here, but that's okay. So my first step is going to be to peen one side of this, and I have just an old hammer here that I've drilled a few divots in, which this is a well-known trick out there in the straight razor restoration forums and everything. I know Philadelphia has actually made some pinning videos, and he uses the same thing. So this is pretty much common knowledge. So I'll set my pin into one of the little divots on one end, and I will put my stainless steel washer on the other. I actually have a larger ball peen hammer than most guys use, so I don't recommend it, but I'm using like a 8-ounce ball peen hammer here. Generally 4 ounces would be recommended. I choke up on it a lot, and so it doesn't hit nearly as hard, and I guess this is just how I started doing it and what I feel comfortable using. So most guys would recommend a 4-ounce ball peen hammer. So I'm just going to tap this a few times until it mushrooms out enough to hold the pin. I've actually mushroomed that pin out just enough to hold the pin. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to push it through. I'll just push it against my hammer here. And then you have all of the extra excess hanging off of the other side here. I have a considerable amount too much here. I like to keep my pin heads fairly small. So I'm going to take it back to the belt sander and trim off maybe a 32nd of an inch. So I've done my trim, and I have just enough to put my washer over it and peen over that side. I have it peened enough so that they're not going anywhere, but I still need to continue working on them until they're very tight. You can either count your hammer strokes, or you can just more or less eyeball it, and I tend to just eyeball it. I try to keep it fairly even on both sides. I want to keep the size of the peen the same on both sides. polished ball peen hammer helps a lot to keep your peen heads very, very smooth. They're very tight and they look good. They're about even on both sides, and so I'm going to move on to pinning the blade. The first thing I do is prepare my number 0 wide brass washers to sit in between the tang and the scale and each scale. And these come, you can buy them from Micro Fasteners, and they're a little bit too wide when you pull them right out of the package. So what I do is I smack them on a flat piece of steel until they're flatter. So I'm going to do that real quick. I just have a flat piece of steel on my bench vise, and it works real well for this. Just flatten them out. When you flatten out these wide washers, sometimes that hole becomes a little bit smaller from the brass closing in on it and deforming. And every once in a while, they won't actually go over the pin. And so I just take a pair of pliers like this and grab on the edge of it, and then I take it over to the drill press and I just run it up and down the drill bit for a second. And that removes just enough metal so that that rod will slip right through. So now I assemble the razor, sliding on my flattened number 0 wide washers between the tang and the scales. Well, that took me like 3 tries, but once you have it assembled, you can eyeball about 1/16 of an inch on one side and clip the other side. And now I have my pin here again, and I'll have to sand off the pinch on the one side of it. So I've sanded off that pinch and left myself about 1/16 of an inch on each side. Grab my stainless washer, and then peen one side. And flip it over, and then peen the other side. When you think you have it tight enough, you keep going, because as everything eases into its new permanent home, it'll loosen up just a little bit. So less pressure, more strikes. That's feeling pretty good.